Welcome to Horror Makes Us Happy, the podcast where we ask the question, what is it about horror that makes us happy? Your hosts are Steve Becker and myself, Chris Whitman, and you can find out more about us at our website, horrormakesushappy.com. Before we get started, a little information for you and the listeners. This is the trigger warning. We're going to be talking about horror movies, horror culture, which could involve anything from murder, rape, suicide, child abuse. Some messed up stuff that some people may not be interested in, so that's your warning. We're going to be talking about fucked up shit. I said it after the warning. That still counts.
Got it in just under the wire.
Just there. Let's see. So, coming up in the future, we're going to be interviewing Rebecca Reinhardt, actress known for such works as The Embalmers, Fright Vision, and Sister Krampus. But today, we have the company of Miguel Rodriguez, organizer and founder of the Horrible Imaginings Film Festival and co-founder of Film Geeks San Diego. Also, just recently found out Googling you're a writer at Dread Central. That's awesome.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Welcome, Miguel.
Thank you. I'm kind of looking forward to this. You came very highly recommended by a great friend of mine, Laura Lee Barr, who's an absolute genius. And so I'm really looking forward to this.
Cool.
Yeah,
we enjoyed talking to her. So in this interview, we'll be asking 3 sets of questions covering your childhood, teenage years, and adulthood to find out what it is about horror that you like. The idea being that if we interview enough people, we might find some interesting common themes or interesting uncommon ones as well. That said, it's not meant to be a therapy session, so if there's anything you don't want to talk about, you'll just say pass and we'll move on. But starting with childhood, what are some of your earliest memories of scary things?
My mom grew up with horror movies. Her mother, my grandmother, really loved horror movies. One story about my grandmother is she had seen Frankenstein, like the James Whale original film, in the cinema with her brother, and she loved it. And her brother was hiding under the chair the whole time, and she always, that was like a mark of real pride for her, you know. So that kind of goes back. So this story does involve mi abuela, my grandmother, and so my parents left me and my infant brother in the care of my grandmother while they went on a date. And, they had this kind of early parental thing where they wanted to make sure that we were sheltered from scary things or whatever. I must have been 3.5 or 4. So I actually don't have personal memory of this. And my brother was an infant, as I said. So anyway, they got home from the date. They entered the house without, making noise, I suppose, because my grandmother was in the middle of telling us a story. And they're like, oh, grandma's telling them a story. And so they like sneak over to get a listen, and they see me wide-eyed on her lap, looking up at her and wrapped in this tale, and and she's holding my brother. And what they hear is, and then he cut the head off and the blood spurted out of it. And they were
perfect timing.
Yes, and it was right at the money shot of the story. And my father, of course, was mortified. His side of the family, and definitely him himself, this is not at all what they were into. And in fact, so we'll probably get in the course of this conversation something I find really fascinating about being raised with horror, and how I feel like one of the attractions about it, like many forbidden fruit, is having to sneak it in, right? Like, oh, this is kind of a bad thing. From on my mom's side, I didn't have to do that, but we did keep it a secret from my dad a lot. And so I was able to kind of experience that forbidden fruit aspect a little bit. And now that I have my own daughter, I feel like, oh, what am I robbing her of? Because she'll see anything. And it's like, oh, I'm kind of robbing her of the rebellious streak that horror can offer. But anyway, so yeah, this goes way, way back. I mean, way, way back. I was watching, there was nothing really forbidden for me as a kid. I watched all, you name it. But I'm really grateful that my mom and her sisters and brothers, they loved film, So I was not really stuck only watching contemporary stuff. We watched lots of classic monster movies and black and white stuff. I grew up with all that. So as much of a horror lover as I am, I'm more of a cinema lover. You mentioned that I'm the co-founder of Film Geek San Diego. We curate all kinds of stuff. Occasionally horror will pop up, but that's not a horror centric organization at all.
Okay.
And I actually really love classic film of all genres.
Interesting. That will make for an interesting call then. I don't know if you've listened to any of our previous calls, but one of the things that we've often talked about is, I don't know how Chris feels about this, but at least me personally, I like to separate, there's an appreciation for horror on a gut level, the emotional, instinctual level, and then there's enjoying something as an auteur. When you're an artist or a writer, or in this case, maybe just in general, a film geek, you start looking at it at the meta level, which, it's kind of like the brain versus heart debate,
yes.
And I think, at least my personal view is, I think the truer connection comes from the heart more than the brain, if that makes sense.
Well, of course.
I guess maybe I shouldn't say it that way. It's not that it's less true from the brain, but it hits different. Let's put it that way.
I would say maybe not truth, but authenticity. Like I maintain that on a real level, horror, or really any confrontational kind of genre like this, or work of art, that the whole point is kind of to appeal to a baser instinct or a more primal instinct, is a more sincere genre. And it's that sincerity, in my view, that accounts for the wildly disparaging reactions to it from the people who can't live without it and the people who don't want anything to do with it. It's the very same power that horror has that makes some people find it absolutely distasteful. And I think that's part of its power. A lot of horror fans, when I talk to them, they want to convince their horror hating acquaintances, friends, or family that, this is worthy, that it's not trash, that it's not dangerous or pernicious. And then
it's art house. It's A24. You'll love it.
Exactly. You can't convince them of that, and certainly not by sharing it with them, because sometimes you can. It's interesting when you do have some converts, but I do think there's something that it attaches itself to that's more at the core of who we are, and I wouldn't want to change that. I think if it didn't upset some people, then it wouldn't work for me as well. You know what I mean? And anyway, we can get more into that later. But like the same goes for the stigma of the genre. Every time at Oscar season, all the horror fans are like, horror's always, left off by the Oscars or whatever. Or anytime there's anything horror at the Oscars, they have to call it something else like thriller, or when they call Get Out a comedy, or
did they call Get Out?
They called Get Out, which is absurd, and I agree that there's absurdity to all these things. However, I'm not sure I would want horror to be recognized by the Oscars. For me, like, one of the things that gives it a kind of primal power is the fact that it is stigmatized. And because it's stigmatized and denigrated, one thing that offers to creators who want to work in this realm is you can kind of drop your pretensions, can't you? I mean, not everybody, obviously. There's pretentiousness within horror, but to some degree, you can drop the pretensions that you're making a Fellini film, or something, or you're attempting to do that.
It's more free will, or rather freeing. It's more. It's where I'm looking for here. Jesus.
I would say sincerity.
Let me give an analogy real quick. So there was a girl that I was dating for a while.
Okay.
That as soon as she realized that I was actually getting along with her parents, we stopped dating.
That's not healthy, but yes.
Yeah, like it's not healthy, but I understand.
But I understand.
I think that's kind of where you're going with this. That if it was accepted, it immediately would be less tasteful to the people that enjoy certain elements of it.
Yes.
Perhaps. I think it's more that this goes back because it's so sincere, because the love for horror and being scared or scary stories in general is such a personal thing. The power of horror is that it appeals to each individual's baggage that they're bringing to it. And that makes it very diverse. And so my friend Steve, so he Uncle Creepy was one of the main voices of Dread Central in the back. He's a wonderful guy. I talk to him all the time. But he always talks in his interviews. He's like, for me, man, horror is an escape. Horror is it's fun. It's an escape. It's what I use to get away from the world. And that's perfectly legitimate. But that's not what it is for me at all. For me, it is the precise opposite. Horror for me is not an escape. It's a confrontation. So, but it's the same thing, that it's the same. We're using the same tool for a radically different and even diametrically opposing purpose. And that's one of the things I find fascinating about talking about it.
So let's kind of put all this to the side for a minute.
Yeah.
And focus again on the childhood part of it. So other than this episode with your grandmother, can you think of other, if you were to say the top 3 most impactful horror things from your childhood?
First of all, part of that I think might be cultural. When I grew up very young, it was on the Rio Grande border of Texas, South Texas, basically Mexico, right? And the definition of horror was that I grew up with and that I still take to heart. It was very broad for us. So I didn't grow up with the term horror movie. I grew up with the term scary movie. Yeah. So one of the movies that always stands out to me is actually a film noir with Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall called Dark Passage. Have you seen Dark Passage?
I have not.
No.
Neither of you. Okay. So Humphrey Bogart plays a convict on the lam. And in order to escape being caught, he gets put under the knife and changes his face. And because
I think I've heard about this.
Yes, it's a true noir does not have a happy ending. But and the other thing that people complain about is one of the things that I really found fascinating as a kid. This is one of the early innovative uses of first-person camera work. So really? Bogey gets his plastic surgery kind of nearly the half mark. You don't see any lead actor. You see it all from his point of view. Right. And that can be
in a mirror.
Yeah, it can be jarring. But you don't see his face until post-op, right? And so suddenly he looks like Humphrey Bogart. You have no idea what he was supposed to look like before. Oh, actually, you do see pictures of him in the newspaper. It's not Bogey, right?
Okay. But they never actually show an actor for him on screen. It's all first person until he's post-op and he sees himself in the mirror for the first time. That's interesting.
Precisely right. Yeah.
Method.
And when he is put under the knife, there are 2 scenes that
that's what you call. How do I do this without having to pay another actor?
Exactly, right.
That's
exactly. What about the press photos? I don't know. Get your nephew. We'll take a picture of him.
Yeah, it's great. I do recommend everybody watch Dark Passage. I think it's altogether a very entertaining film. But when it comes to horror. Well, when it comes to horror, there are 2 scenes that always stood out to me as really frightening. And so one of them, Bogey gets put under the knife to get plastic surgery on his face. And right as he's kind of going under, the plastic surgeon's, he's not a reputable plastic surgeon. He's kind of this alleyway plastic surgeon. Mm-hmm. And he's also kind of a jerk. So he's he's kind of ribbing the character, saying, maybe I'll make you look like a bulldog, and then that's the last thing he hears before he passes out from the anesthetic. And so the next bit of film is a dream sequence while he's under. He's terrified of what he's going to look like at the other end of this. And it's kind of appealing. Right. And so it's a really, really wonderful bit of cinema. And then later on is one of my favorite bits of what I'll call dread. It gets to this point where even though he's done this. This is, you now see Humphrey Bogart in all his glory. He's hiding away in this shitty San Francisco like hovel by the port, and he could get caught, and things are getting really heated, and the suspense is building up. But in this scene, there's nothing he can do. You know, he's hiding away, and all you hear, it's the soundscape. And we can talk about this too. The power of horror largely is auditory. I think that's fascinating because film is largely a visual medium, but sound is so much of it.
Oh yeah, the sound is
so key. And in this scene, in the distance, it's night, it's dark, it's drab, it's pure noir. You hear the foghorn of one of the ships in the port, and there's something about it that's so haunting. I used to have dreams about this. The other one I bring up is Metropolis. You know, it's clearly like a science fiction film, but there's a scene where the doctor is chasing Maria through the catacombs, and the lighting, it's brilliant. It's lit with just this lantern that he's carrying after her, and it is a pure horror scene, pure horror, and it's wonderful. So I can go on and on. That's another one from when I was a kid, by the way. Metropolis.
Okay, yeah, I was going to ask, did you watch Metropolis as a child? So it fits. It fits.
It does fit.
Yeah.
Other movies from when I was that old, you know, honestly, The Wolfman. So, which is really interesting. I came to be a lover of werewolf movies because of Michael Jackson, the Thriller video. My mom, out of the library, got the Making of Thriller VHS. So at this point, it must have been like 86 or so. I made her get that thing out of the library 50 billion times. I watched it over and over. It's how I found out, like, wow, like the artists who work behind the scenes, you know, like Rick Baker is on that, turning Michael Jackson. They have a full thing where they're showing how they're putting Michael Jackson in the werewolf makeup. And I just thought it was amazing. And in the making of Thriller, Michael Jackson says the reason he wanted John Landis to direct the video is he saw American Werewolf in London. And that's how I discovered American Werewolf in London, was because and so I asked my mom to get that, and that became one of my favorite films. I made her watch the goddamn thing 50,000 times. So a lot of people in this era where films weren't quite as readily available as they are now might feel some kinship with this. I would go to the library or even the school library, and there would always be some kind of kid-centric book about monster movies. And so I would go through and thumb through all these books, and I would make lists. That's how I found out. I remember seeing a picture of Vincent Price with the Tingler, and I didn't get to see the Tingler until much later, but I always knew about it and desperately wanted to see it because I saw it in that book. And there was, of course, a whole list of werewolf movies, and I just made the list, and we scoured anywhere we could find to find some of those. And so obviously, like the Lon Chaney Jr. Wolfman was fairly, I remember being able to see that a bunch. Frankenstein vs. Meets the Wolfman was one that I was able to see, but there were a lot that I had trouble finding, like Curse of the Werewolf with Oliver Reed. I remember desperately wanting to see and didn't get to see it until later. But the point I'm trying to make here is it became a search, right? At the time, it became like, what is there? The first part of the search is what has existed? Why did it exist? And then how can I actually experience it firsthand? Because I seeing Oliver Reed as the big, like, kind of gray, silverish looking werewolf in the pictures in a book, I already loved the film. It's like, that's something very strange, isn't it? Yeah. And I just so wanted to see it. And that need to see it was part of, I don't know if that really, I don't hear of if that really exists to that degree, the kind of like search. Maybe it does. Maybe I'm being a Luddite, but I can relate.
I've watched quite a few films where I've just found them from thumbing through some, anthology of horror movies over the years or over this year book. Like, oh shit, well, this looks awesome. Find that.
Yeah. Well, it gets kind of crazy because, like, I see what's available now, just like readily available on Tubi or whatever. Yeah. And I was like, motherfucker, I spent like $90 on a shitty 9th generation VHS in 1996 because this thing was never going to be available anywhere. And
now it's on Blu-ray, 4K.
Yeah. Well, you bring up a really interesting thing because let's talk about physical media, 4K Blu-ray. Generally speaking, the ones that get the loving treatment. So yes, the Spider-Man movies you can get on 4K, but it's just like, here you go. We put this together. There might be a couple of special features, but the things that get like the box set are either Criterion, which is one end, or mostly they're boutique labels doing really weird horror, science fiction, B-movie, cult movie stuff, right?
So hang on, I want to talk about the werewolves thing because that sounded like there was a passion there.
Yeah, I can relate. Similar vein. I also had influence from the Thriller video as a child. Sorry, Steve.
I love that.
So where's that passion come from with the werewolves?
If I can think back and get into my head from that age, it was the desire. I think it truly is the desire to let loose, like the most important part of the werewolf movies for me, and I think for people who like them, is not the wolf going on a rampage and not the psychological torment of whoever turns into the werewolf. It's that one. It's the scene of the person turning into. It's the transformation. It's the metamorphosis. It's that even if it's the old school kind of like fade from one stage of werewolfism to the next, it still works. It worked for me as a kid. I still kind of love it. Or if it's something as kind of magnificent as American Werewolf in London or Wild as The Howling, you look for that transformation scene, and that's why I think like. I haven't loved them as much in the modern era because I just don't, CGI. I just don't care. It's too easy,
Yeah.
I don't. Well, I don't want to say that's denigrating that part. But
I was just gonna say, there's some CGI artists going, "Fuck you, man."
No, I don't mean, let me clarify. It's not easy to do for the artist.
Yeah.
The transformation on the character looks too easy. Right? It doesn't seem as like bubbly and painful and crackly.
Yeah, like there's not as much sacrifice
have to work for it.
Exactly.
It's too smooth. Yeah. So
give me a good old Skinwalker rips the flesh off and there's a werewolf underneath transformation.
Okay,
that is the best.
That's wonderful, and I agree. Like speaking of movies that I saw younger, that Company of Wolves, the Neil Jordan film. Awesome. Not necessarily it's more of a fairy tale, but obviously it's like a take on Red Riding Hood if you haven't seen it. But to your point though, why was it so powerful for my young kid? I think it's because horror in general it appeals to the primal, right? It appeals to our if I was going to use an antiquated psychological term, it appeals to our id.
You're not wrong, though.
I mean, Jekyll and Hyde is the same way. The Incredible Hulk. Why are it so powerful? Or
something that's now you go, Steve.
It's also common for that to be interesting to a child because typically children, the power dynamic between children and adults, that's something that children crave is the ability to let loose, like you say, and to have the power to do what they want, the self-actualization that often is missing in a lot of youths.
It's true. And if you think about young kids, their only source of power is like a temper tantrum, right?
Right.
So it is very interesting. What always gives me pause is why isn't it universal?
Because not every child needs that. I mean, every person is different, and every family is different too.
It's so funny how hard it is to see outside ourselves, But
often we want the thing that we do not have. So if there's a family where somebody is allowed to have their free expression, they might not crave it as much as you do.
Well, see, that gets on my point of the forbidden fruit of like, what am I doing to my kid?
Right.
Like, should I forbid
Well,
so she can have the joy of going against my will and doing it anyway?
No, because she'll just find something else that you won't like, and then
I
know. They'll find it. It's just
it'll be Christianity or something.
Right. So, did you dress up for Halloween? As a Wolfman, I assume?
So I have, for the last several years, my programming partner here in San Diego, she's done a haunted house, like kind of a haunted presentation at her house for Halloween for the last over 3 decades.
I was going to say, let's talk about childhood, but when you said 3 decades.
Yes. Well, I haven't been doing that for 3 decades. I've only lived in San Diego since 2009. So I've been doing that for like 6 years, 7 years, something like that. Not since 2009, but the last several years I've been an actor in this thing. And it's less of what a lot of people think of a haunted house, of walking through a scary hall and people jumping out and saying boo. It's more like a little mini theatrical presentation.
Right.
But yeah, so
hang on. We'll talk about that when we get to the adult section.
Yes. Okay.
So for right now, just talking about childhood, did you have, like, for example, a favorite costume when you were a kid?
Oddly enough, I think I was a werewolf once. But the one that comes, I was a mad scientist. I remember I wanted to be a scientist. So I was like a classic, Colin Clive mad scientist. So that one I came back to a few times.
Okay.
Which is funny because it's the other spectrum of the base animal is the mad genius. Yeah.
Do you think it was tied to the Jekyll and Hyde thing, or was there something else?
I think it's more tied to the Frankenstein thing than Jekyll and Hyde. It was less of I want to become my darker half, and more of I want to create, I guess like I want to play God, I want to create my own, and then of course have it completely blow up in my own face. But
I would argue maybe that's the dichotomy of, the Jekyll and Hyde. Mad scientist is the one who's in control, plays God. Werewolf is the one who loses control on purpose and is free.
Yeah. Well, when you say is free, I think when it comes to the werewolf thing, that's key, right? There is something kind of trapping about conscious, like not consciousness, but our conscience. There's something kind of trapping about having to get along in a society with other human beings. That it's important, but it hurts sometimes. It hurts to be able to do that. So there is something freeing about just being a thoughtless monster that just needs to, the basis of existence to feed and whatever else.
Any least favorite costumes?
Least favorite costume? I gotta be honest. I don't. This is gonna sound. I don't really remember my Halloweens that well. Okay. I'd have to really think about it.
Not every question is going to hit. We just ask because you never know what's going to hit and what's not.
Well, it does. It is. So the question is hitting not because you're getting a specific answer, but because this is something I haven't really thought about before. Like I don't think anybody really asked me that, and I am being confronted with, it really doesn't stick out in my mind, and honestly, it's making me interested in my own self.
Okay.
Let's see. Did you have any really scary dreams when you were a kid?
Oh yeah, a bunch, and I'm actually depressed that I don't still get them.
So, I miss those scary dreams.
I do, and I will say this because I still get scary dreams, but my scary dreams now are the film festival is going on and we're not planned well enough. Adult
fears like, oh my God, I forgot to file my taxes.
Yes, precisely. That's exact. And that's like almost every day.
Or I filed my taxes and I'm not wearing any pants, that one all the time.
I have yet to have the no pants dream, but I do have the teeth falling out dream pretty often. That's pretty classic. So that's the kind of dream I have now. I don't have anything like with monsters or ghosts or fun stuff anymore. And I can't remember the last time I did, frankly. But I did have them as a kid, and I would use them to draw pictures, and it became kind of a, they were scary for a bit, but they did help me.
Do you remember what any of them were?
Yeah, I used to have dreams of kind of a Phantom of the Opera type figure. And the reason I always thought of this figure, and I'm not going to use a pronoun because it's impossible to tell the sex or gender of this figure, but
it's very 2022 of you, sir.
It's true. Well, I mean, even in 1988 or whatever, I had no idea because there was a large like black hat and a large black coat and
just an ominous amorphous figure.
Yeah, and the figure was always on the rooftops as I was trying to get away. And I always, even as a kid, I always thought of it as kind of a Phantom of the Opera kind of thing. Phantom of the Opera, by the way, is another big one from when I was a kid.
Yeah.
And, that film ends with a magnificent rooftop scene with Lon Chaney. And so that's why I always came back to that, which is funny because usually people think of Phantom in the catacombs because in most of the film, he's in the catacombs under the opera house. But that end where he gets chased onto the roof is great.
Do you think the dream was connected to you remembering the film?
I think that is a distinct possibility. Yes.
What was it was there something you loved about Phantom of the Opera, or was there something you were afraid of related to that one?
Possibly. I think there's a really interesting dichotomy here because it was an attraction to the presence of the Phantom in addition to any fear of the Phantom's presence. They both were coexisting, these polar opposite emotions. And, my favorite scene in Phantom, this is no surprise. It's most people's favorite scene. There's a scene in the Lon Chaney silent film that's in color. And the Phantom comes out dressed as Death in a very bright fire engine crimson operatic costume with a skull face, and it's so theatrical and perfect. And the ability to command an audience like that was something that has always just appealed to me. And so, it's interesting. Like, if you ask people why they love serial killer stories, or people are interested in things like Ted Bundy, this gets out of my wheelhouse a bit, but a lot of times the answer is kind of similar. Like the fear of that and the repulsion of that coexists with the level of kind of individual power that person has. And I think power does, the craving of a human being for some level of control is a big part of that. Like, you don't want to be the victim who loses control, but to be that person who has ultimate control over another human being. There's something, I think, intoxicating about the idea of that.
Okay. Let's see if there's any other childhood questions that I want to ask. Did you have anything actually scary happen in your childhood, and like in real life?
So my dad was, before he met my mom, this is pre-Miguel, but was a Roman Catholic priest. Ended up working for the diocese later in that career. At this point, he was working for the diocese in South Texas. And he loves to travel. He still loves to travel. Gave me my own love for travel, so I'm grateful for that. But, we weren't exactly... when you have a family of 3 sons, you don't have an unending supply of funds and financial resources when you work for the diocese, right?
Yeah.
But what you do have are connections. So we would do these road trips all the time. Like, I remember we went to the 1984 World's Fair in Vancouver, drove there. And that is a very clear memory. But it's where we would stay. We would stay in these places run by the diocese. And some of them were really creepy, A lot of my memories being generally kind of mortified were of are connected to religion. They're connected to religion. Luckily, you know, there are people who have far worse experiences than I do with people in authority in the church. So I don't want to give any kind of impression that I experienced anything like that, thankfully. But I did have lots of experiences with authority in the church that that kind of has shaped my current distaste for it.
Okay.
So
happens.
I understand that it happens. Yeah. And it's less of a one incident and more of I lived through it kind of. This is these kinds of things were in perpetuity of little to mid instances of kind of just abject like cruelty or it's interesting. So like a lot of, as far as traumatic events, a lot of them are connected to that. There was also one traumatic event. Well, you know, I grew up in Maryland, in Maryland, and there were a couple of times, getting jumped or getting beaten that jump out to me. Like, so at this point, I'm closer to like 10. We moved to Maryland when I was 10 years old.
Mm.
So, you know, there's one time I remember being like just beaten with legs of a chair because it was on a basketball court. And
Jesus.
and I couldn't play very well. And so I had and I hid that from my parents. I had never told them about this, but I had these welts. There was a straight line across my sternum of welts because the legs of the chair were kind of bumpy. Mm. And so where they struck, it didn't strike evenly. So it was like these risen welts that were in a row from where the actual wood connected. And I have a very clear memory of like lifting my shirt later on and seeing that and being kind of freaked out.
Pretty horrific.
So yeah, you know, like
kids in Maryland don't fuck around, huh?
No, they don't. Yeah, I don't.
And you said it was you didn't play very well. Was it your teammates beat you up because you didn't play very well?
It wasn't teammates because it wasn't like you just go to the court and there's just kids playing.
It's a pickup game.
Yeah, okay.
Game. Yeah.
So it's fucked up. Some new kid who's just not that good at basketball yet. Maybe if he had some practice. No, let's beat the shit out of him.
Yeah.
What the hell?
So, bully's gonna bully.
I guess.
Bully's gonna bully.
It's counterintuitive. You know, you beat up nerds for being nerds. You don't beat up people that are trying to get good at basketball.
You know, I never got bullied too much for nerdiness. It made it hard to relate to people. I didn't really get friends until high school. And a lot of that was around similar kind of nerdy things or music or movies and stuff like that. Mm. And one of the nice things about horror is it kind of like, I think if you're a very open horror fan, it might make you someone other people don't want to be friends with, but it doesn't necessarily make you the target of bullies. You know?
True. Yeah. There's always kind of a safety blanket to just be that weirdo goth kid in high school who the bullies wouldn't mess with just because, he's weird. I won't mess with him.
Bingo. That's it exactly. Yeah.
So speaking of, phobias or existing traumas, you mentioned that there was maybe a distaste for authority or distaste for cruelty. Anything else that really stuck with you?
Well, the thing that has shaped me and even to my political leanings and the way I view the world, my worldview, is definitely, I think, when people in power unfairly wield that power against others. And, it's so funny because I think the mainstream view of horror, when people are afraid of it or think it's pernicious or think it's harmful, what I find very interesting about that is my experience with it is it has the opposite effect. For me, horror is an empathy building tool. And that's how we use it for our film festival. It's how we use it. It's how we wield it as an empathy building tool. Like when we have, what's interesting about horror is because we talked before about how it's so particular to an individual. What that does is it allows a compare and contrast. We're dealing here like if you listen to horror fans, their arguments are really kind of annoying to me. It's true, because 99% of the arguments you'll hear from horror fans online or whatever, like let's take The Witch, right? A great film, but it's like, but it's not really horror. I didn't think it was scary. Blah blah blah. But yes,
she ground up a baby into raspberry jam. That's kind of horrific.
Freaking scary. I think it's a magnificent film. But it starts the general arguments that you'll hear online, and I hate to go online because it's every conversation is nonsense online, but
it's toxic.
It can be toxic, but really what bothers me is it's so surface. Like, it's not horror.
Everybody has their own tastes. Everybody has their own tastes, and there are a lot of people who are judgmental.
Yeah.
It's true. And
it's not just in the horror genre, it's all over the world. I mean, but
what's scary to you might not be scary to me. Right. What's scary to Chris might not be scary to Steve. And I think
and it's stupid to be judgmental about that. But
it's stupid to actually like try to categorize something as one way or another, because it wasn't. What I try to do is foster the conversation of,
I mean, I can kind of understand the categorization, because that helps you then say, okay, well, if I like this, then I want to see more of it. But,
and it helps others find
avoid the things that you don't. Yeah, and avoid the things that you don't like.
See, but I want people to find the things that don't necessarily work for them and figure out why. Or what's more interesting.
Not everybody wants to do that.
I know that. See, that's that gray area thing. But as a curator of a film festival, that's my job.
Right.
So especially every film festival, whether it's Latino Film Festival, or I partner with Film Out San Diego, or I partner with Asian Film Festival, I'm not trying to find everything that's going to be for everyone. And my most exciting parts as a curator are when not only is something that didn't work for some, this is why In the Theater really works really well, because if you watch The Witch, Steve, at your house, and Chris, you watch it at your house, and then I watch it at my house, and we come together later to talk about it, it doesn't quite work as well. But Steve, it didn't work for you, but Chris, it worked for you. And you're sitting watching it together, and Steve is like kind of getting a little bit impatient, but Chris is like really freaking out, and you have visceral in the moment reactions, and you're experiencing that simultaneously, and you feel each other's reactions to it simultaneously. Then the conversation we have when the credits roll is very interesting. Like, if I can compare and contrast what my fears are with what your fears are, even though you're a woman who's 60 years old and comes from Zimbabwe, then we are connecting on a purely inherent core nature, right? That I love. That is what excites me, not just about horror, but about curating and fostering discussions.
Well, the fostering discussions thing, I mean, it's interesting. It's kind of tangential to horror. I think I might see a connection, but I want to kind of put that to the side for a moment. Sure. Maybe we'll come back to that. Let's move into the teenage years stuff. Yeah. So if we were to pick the top 3 things that come to your mind of, horror, books, movies, TV, whatever, what would the top 3 things from your adolescent years be?
Like when I got into high school and stuff, it's very classic for horror fans is like you start to look for the more extreme stuff. And so I really, I think top things from when I was a teenage years would be like Peter Jackson's Brain Dead, Dead Alive. And it's kind of freaking people out by introducing them to really extreme stuff like Cannibal Holocaust or whatever. But
okay, hang on. So let's start with the first one you mentioned, Dead Alive.
Okay.
What did you love about that one?
It's a cartoon.
Yeah.
Dead Alive is a cartoon. Like the gags in it are purely Tom and Jerry.
Even the characters and the design of the characters, how bright and colorful the woman's makeup is and their clothing is just very, you're right. It is a very cartoonish film. It reminds me of like, I don't know, some short films I've seen where people try and make like, what if a cartoon came to life in real life? It's kind of like on that same vein.
Yeah, and some of those are horrendous, right?
Yeah.
Like the real life looking Beavis and Butthead. Oh,
yeah.
Just
yeah. So you liked this one because it was funny?
I liked it because it was, first of all, like nothing I had really seen before. Like, for example, there's the classic line, "I kick ass for the Lord." So there's a scene in the middle of it in a cemetery at night where zombies are rising, and the vicar of the cemetery he flies out onto the scene and starts just like wailing on these zombies with kung fu moves, and then he turns and says, "I kick ass for the Lord." Like that. When I first saw that, oh God, I must have been maybe 14. That blew my mind. I was like, what?
Why?
I'll never forget that. Why did it? I have no idea. I think because it was so funny. Like it landed, like the joke lands. The timing of the joke lands. All right, let's be honest, it's very irreverent. And I dug that as a kid. But also in a way, like one thing that was not totally in my on my radar at the time is you're rooting for the priest in that scene. And I didn't find myself rooting for priests very much at that point in my life. So I thought that was interesting. The other thing in Dead Alive is it has a zombie baby.
It does?
Because two zombies have sex and she gets pregnant. I mean, it's
right? Like, I don't think many people have done that. That's maybe like one of 3 ever.
Yeah, and anytime you see zombie babies, pretty much after, a lot of times it's after that movie. But the way this movie does it, it's not just that there's a zombie baby. It's like if you remember, I think one of the weakest ways was in the Zack Snyder Dawn of the Dead remake. Yeah. There's a zombie baby for like a flash of a second. It's like
its eyes are different. Oh, yeah, shoot it! Done.
It was lame, but the. Not that I think Zack Snyder should have gone the Peter Jackson route, because the way it's a cartoon, and the sheer evidence that this is just a cartoon is Peter Jackson, who is one of the writers of this film as well as the director, has a zombie baby up here, and the first thing he has this character do is decide it must be a good idea to take the zombie baby on a walk in the park.
Uh-huh.
And the hijinks that ensue are just outstanding. They're so funny. And it's like, what is this scene doing in this movie?
Right? Like, yeah, you're right. It's very cartoonish in that regard, that it just kind of immediately splits to a scene of, all right, and now we're going to the park with the baby in a stroller. For why?
For why, yeah. And
you still have an army of zombies back at what are you doing?
And the idea, I mean, the sheer level of bloodshed in this movie too,
ridiculous.
Up to that point, yeah, I had never seen.
Okay, so what I'm getting at still comes back to the word audaciousness.
Yeah, it's absolutely audacious, but it's not audacious in like Cannibal Holocaust, where like, let's see how far we can push the envelope. It's more like, let's see how much fun Peter Jackson can have swimming in blood.
Right. Yeah. Speaking of Cannibal Holocaust, that's where I was going to go next. So what did you love about that one?
Love is a weird word. I never loved it.
What did you enjoy about it, I guess?
I think the Europeans, what they do in order to get good footage, in order to make a good documentary, is they set fire to a village that they come upon and then film the ensuing chaos as if they were catching like action, right? So they were falsifying what they had done, and they were committing atrocities in order to get a good documentary. And so they meet their comeuppance, and that sense of justice that comes up like was really intoxicating to me as a teenager. And also, let's be honest, like I had a curatorial drive since I was a kid. What I mean by that is, if I saw Terminator when I was 8, I wanted all my friends to see it. You know, I wanted to be the one to introduce them to this. And so, like, at this point, you know, if someone said, "Oh, I just saw Scream, that was scary," I'd be like, "That's nothing. Look at this." You know what I mean? So there was some of that too. And to see people's kind of like the mortified looks on their faces as they watched Cannibal Holocaust, that was, you know, for a 14-year-old me, yeah, that's really nice. You know, I loved that.
So in a way, like one of the appeals of it was the fact that it was like a badge of honor, or almost a newly discovered weapon you could yield against people who say they know about horror. Like, you don't know.
Yes.
Yeah, at the time,
that's definitely something I have outgrown. Like so I'll give you an adult Miguel comparison, because I still like mortifying people, but the thing that I tend to do that now is with the Star Wars holiday special. like every Christmas, we invite new people for the Star Wars holiday special, and I don't even watch the TV. I turn around and watch people watching it, and it's my joy, you know.
It's the new Two Girls, One Cup.
Ooh. Yeah.
It's a safe for work 2 girls, 1 cup.
Yes, of course.
Yeah. You know, like the animal stuff. I mean, even I've kind of I've outgrown that. It's not really, at the time I was like, yeah, I'm just going to tough this out, man. It's a test. I have no need to do that anymore. I'm not, and I have no full understanding of why I felt the need at the time.
Again, badge of honor. It's like a thing that you tough it through and say, I've been through it. And yeah, at the time, I think it was interesting because of the overall shock of it. But yeah, that is one of the few things I look back on that movie that not a fan of anymore. It's like, all right, this is actual animal abuse.
Yeah, no, cool. It's radically fucked up. Ruggero Deodato has multiple times expressed regret for doing it, the director.
Different times,
there are things if you are, so I did talk about being obsessed with the Michael Jackson Making of Thriller video. So, you know, ever since then, I was always kind of very interested in how tricks or gags were pulled off. And Cannibal Holocaust still, to this day, to my mind, has one of the kind of gore gags is so brilliant in its simplicity. So in the scene, it's a really horrendous looking image, but there is a woman who is vaginally impaled on this pike lengthwise, and it's coming out of her mouth, and it looks very real. And it looks so real that Deodato and his crew were taken to court because people assumed it was a snuff film. And in court, they had to demonstrate how they pulled it off. And
well,
again,
I think that's speaking more
simple.
to the. Sorry, I was going to say, I think that's speaking more to the auteur part of it. It sounded like the real emotional part of Cannibal Holocaust to you was the justice comeuppance.
The vengeance.
That's what I really, when I had an emotional connection to the film, that was it.
What about Bad Taste?
Bad Taste is just, everything about it is the same reasons that I love Dead Alive. You know, it's cartoony, it's over the top, it's comedy, and the comedy lands. Like, you know, there's a character played by the director Peter Jackson himself named Derek, and at one point he falls from a great height. And it splits his skull open, and piece of his brain falls out of his head. And anytime the piece of brain falls out, he has a little seizure and can't think until he scoops up that little piece of brain, shoves it back into his skull, and then uses his belt to kind of like clamp his skull shut. And this happens various times throughout the film.
Absolute realism, not cartoony at all. Nope.
It's completely insane. Like, who? Oh, and then there's another, like, one of my favorite jokes in it, and this is what I mean. Like, comedy and horror, they act on the same terms in that timing is everything. Like, for it to work, it has to work like perfectly. And there's one scene where one of the characters, there's an alien in the room, and he takes the alien's head and pulls the head out of its body with the spinal column thrashing around. And then the guy pulls the spinal column off of the head and punts it like a football out of the window of this house. And he immediately follows it up with this line, "The old magic's still there." It's like, who writes this? And yeah, I think it's so brilliant. It's like those little touches are so good. And so, yeah, I think at the time, why did I love it? It was comedy that was so like audacious. Audacious is the word. Like, who can I show this to that they will think it's funny? And if they think it's funny, then they can be my friend.
Okay.
Did you?
Or would be mortified.
It's a horror respect benchmark, if you will.
Yes.
Hey, before I ask the next question, I wanted to ask you something. So there's like this low rumble I keep hearing, and I think it's because maybe your mic is on a desk or you've got like a keyboard that you're...
It might be. Let me move my mic away from the tower a little more.
Yeah, when you moved it, I heard some rumbling. So that's what I think it was.
Okay. Do you hear it now?
Yeah, you moved something.
Oh, well, now I've got a cat walking on the desk. Come here.
Are you doing something important? Can I mess it up?
Yeah, right. Speaking of animals, I was hearing a squeaky toy in the background. Is it possible to close the door?
That would be my daughter, and no, I'm in an open floor plan. Yeah.
I thought you had a dog that was playing with a squeak toy.
Yeah,
hey, squeak toys are for dogs and kids, you know.
That's true. The 3-year-old has a similar mental capacity as a smart.
Yes, that's true.
Having a 3-year-old niece, I knew it was a kid. I figured that was it, and also I know that's impossible to stop. So I just figured we'll just deal with it. 3-year-olds are very opinionated in their activities, and you will not stop them ever.
Well, my wife, she is now watching her iPad in the far side of the living room. So.
The tablet generation.
For the next 5 minutes, anyway.
Yeah, we'll see. Yeah.
All right, cool. So did you have any scary dreams in your teenage years?
I think in my teenage years, most of my nightmares were around friendships and relationships. See, that wasn't me.
That was
me. and religious stuff, because at that point, I'll be honest with you, I connect every experience in my life to why I love horror. Like, you know, I said at the beginning, I don't think of horror films for me as an escape. I think of them as a confrontation. I'm looking to be uncomfortable when I watch things for the most part. And that's kind of weird. I think that's weird for a lot of people, especially now. You'll hear conversations of, well, you gave a trigger warning at the beginning of this episode, which I appreciate. I think trigger warnings, you know, in the horror realm, there are a lot of people who think they're like not necessary and pandering. And I disagree. I think for people who don't need the trigger warning, they might seem that way, but for people who do, they're necessary. So, but you know, I'm kind of looking to be triggered. That's really. There was a book I just read, a novel, and the whole reason I read it is because a review on Goodreads started with a trigger warning. I was like, oh, I've got to read that.
Well, yeah, it's like you know, music albums, explicit content. Yeah. Hey, that was good.
Totally. Selling point. Yeah. No, absolutely.
Let's jump into adult years. So if we were to pick top 3 things for adult years.
So right now, man, that's hard. So let me clarify this question. Top 3 things that came out recently, or top 3 things just in general?
Yeah, we understand that top, you know, favorite things can change over time. It's just like, you know, if you were to press to pick right now, what would you say right now?
Okay, so I will say the French New Extreme film Inside is one that sticks with me really, really. I love it to death.
You will never look at a pair of scissors the same way again.
Yeah, that's one of the movies that my wife and I first saw together. And
oh, nice. Yeah, a little romantic evening alone, you know, just, hey, you know what? Let's have another kid.
Well, I won't say that, but I met my wife because I used to do a film series, just a more fun one at a bar called Shot by Shot. And the very first one we did was Battle Royale. And that's how I met her. So nice. It's pretty cool, back in 2012. But so Inside, man, this is a very difficult question.
I find that usually the first thing that comes to mind is accurate.
Yeah.
So without overthinking it, what comes to mind?
Like Encounters of the Spooky Kind. So I'm going to bring up Encounters of the Spooky Kind because I have In fact, and I'll go with that, and I will go with El Santo contra el Monstruos, El Santo, the luchador from Mexico. So I've been a big explorer in recent years, especially since maybe I was in my mid-20s till now, of looking for genre or B-movie world cinema from countries that did not intend an international audience. This is a very specific. This has a lot of specificity to it. So, like, if you look at Inside, that's a French film, and but it did have an international audience in mind. So, it can be watched pretty much anywhere in the world, and people pretty much get what's going on, right? However, there are countries that have very insular film industries, and some of these industries are really large, like Turkey. For years, that was one of the third biggest film industries in the world. None of these were exported. These were intended for a Turkish audience. That's it.
So it sounds like we're going into the auteur part of it again. Let me rein you back into what did you love about Inside on the horror, like the emotional response? Inside
just was a very visceral film.
Yeah.
What's visceral about Inside is it's the horror is based around some aspects that are usually untouched or too taboo. So it's a home invasion film, and the victim is a pregnant woman, and essentially the invader wants to use a pair of shears to cut her baby out of her stomach, and so it's that you feel there are scenes in this film where you feel it in your molars, you know. Like, you can't even explain it on an intellectual level.
That's a really good way of describing that level of cringe, the good cringe, like we were talking about earlier. Is like, you kind of feel that nerve pain in your teeth.
Yes,
it's that bad.
Yeah. Oh, it's like, oof, it's a rough one. This is like trigger warning. But to try to beware for the auteur thing here, it's beautiful. Like,
it's very well done. Yeah, I mean, the special effects in some of the recent French horror films are just like insane. That
unbelievable.
What's the other one?
High Tension.
High Tension, yeah.
Martyrs.
Haute Tension.
Oh yeah, Haute Tension, yeah. Martyrs is another one that gets cited a lot.
Yeah.
Anything by Gaspar Noé, of course. But
for Inside, it was the discomfort, the confrontation, I guess, is where you're going with that one. That's what you got out of that one.
It's not just the confrontation. There has to. It's credits roll, and the world looks less bleak, because at least it's not that.
Right.
Yeah.
For me, there's a lot of therapeutic aspects to putting myself through the meat grinder.
What about Encounters of the Spooky Kind?
In Hong Kong, even that one is kind of low on the experience. But what it does when you see these films from other countries that were intended only for their own cultures, and I know you said this was auteur, but this is actually really central to the point, is it is reflecting the zeitgeist and the feelings and the emotions of just that culture, of just that person. And sometimes these seem really foreign to us. A lot of these are not available with subtitles. They're becoming a little bit more so, but films from Turkey, films from Indonesia, films from the Philippines.
So it was the fact that it was exposing you to a culture that you were previously familiar with?
Yes, and it is the compare contrast, because there are things that are familiar and there are things that are radically unfamiliar.
Sort of an educational.
I don't even know if it's educational. I think it's more embedded in my core than that. Although I won't deny any educational things. It's like I said before. It's the emotional connection I'm having to them. It's also a new experience. Like I'm really interested in experiencing new things. I recently saw a film from Singapore.
Actually, hang on. I'm going to pause you there. So I'm keeping an eye on the clock. We forgot to tell you, we've got another call at 4:00, which is 45 minutes away, and we've still got a bunch more questions to go through.
Shit. Okay. Yeah.
Lightning round.
Well, Laura should have warned you. I'm a very wordy guy.
She may have brought it up.
I don't remember if she did or not. So Luchador from Mexico. What did you like about that one?
Well, I'm Mexican. I grew up with them. So that's one thing.
Fair.
But the thing about it is it's the same thing I'm talking about. That is something specific to Mexico. They were brought to the U.S. to some degree by a guy named K. Gordon Murray in the 60s as kind of curiosities and look how goofy this is. In Mexico, these films were events. You know, El Santo himself had like 56 films. It's
a lot.
It's a lot. And these were family experiences, which meant they were every genre. There were James Bond movies, there were horror films, there were monster films, there were spy movies,
there were franchise
superhero movies. Yeah, there were everything. It's everything in the kitchen sink approach to it.
So you mentioned that, there was like 50 movies. I'm guessing some of them were horror based, and that's how you got into it, maybe? Or
Almost
did you get
all of them have horror elements? And yes.
Really?
Oh yeah. Almost all of them have horror elements. Yeah. So many of them have monsters, vampire women, los mujeres vampiras. It's great.
So, you mentioned seeking out these regional films that were not intended to be international. And I'm guessing this is tying in with your desire or appreciation of being a curator and sharing them with other people.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. No, I have a series called Delirio, and that's exactly the mission statement.
Okay. I'm going to skip some of the other adult questions and go into what our wrap-up questions would be. There's still a couple questions here to go through, but these questions, it's not just covering a particular time in your life, it's covering your whole life. And these questions don't just relate to horror. It could be any genre, but the first two I'll give you the two questions at the same time, because the answers could be the same movie or it could be two different movies, depending on how this goes. But the first two questions would be, what do you consider your favorite movie? And what would you say would be the movie you've watched more times than any other? Again, not just horror based, but overall.
Well, you're very lucky, because there's a book series called My Favorite Horror Movie, and I was invited to write an essay for it. So I already have this in mind. It's the 1954 Gojira, the first Godzilla film.
Okay.
And in my essay, I go very, very in-depth into why that is. Also why I consider it a horror film. But it's also the one, not only have I probably watched the most number of times, but I own the most copies of in various formats. I think I have like 16 different versions of it, ranging from VHS to Laserdisc to Blu-ray to DVD.
So understanding that you've already written an essay on this, can you give us the highlights?
The highlights are, all right, the thing I compare my feeling of this to is The Little Prince, right? So The Little Prince is a book read by children that can be read at every stage of someone's life and has new kind of meaning for them. Yeah. Godzilla is the same way. The first Gojira is the same way. As a kid, I was introduced to it because my dad took me to see The Return of Godzilla in 1985 in the theater that had been released in the theater. That was my first experience watching Godzilla in 85. Unforgettable experience. Then finally getting able to see via bootleg at this time the original Japanese version as opposed to the American King of Monsters version, which are different by about 45 minutes. And, a lot of the very obvious allusions to Godzilla's metaphor for the atomic bomb has been removed. Like, the film opens up with a fishing boat getting subjected to radiation from Godzilla. That was a direct allusion to an actual fishing boat that in the South Pacific ended up getting contaminated. I'm gonna
jump in and pause you again and say emotional connection. What was your emotional connection with the movie?
That's my emotional connection. Like, I don't know how you get more emotional than that. Like, for me, it's...
But you didn't describe an emotion. You're talking about a boat getting hit by radiation.
Oh, okay.
What's the emotion?
I think the emotion is how... It's very complicated to explain the emotion, because mostly we devastated two cities in Japan, laid waste to them in a way that psychologically affected that culture to this day.
So let's try to identify the emotions. Right now, it sounds like you're talking about shame.
Yeah, the shame is definitely it. It's hard. Clearly, my ways to describe my own emotions are very complicated and hard for me to describe. And I think that's why I love this film so much. because it gives me a focal point for the ways these events make me feel.
That's understandable, especially if the two that you mentioned are shame and confusion. So confusion surrounding this is understandable.
I will say this for emotion. The emotion I feel most often every day is rage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, and it's something that I struggle very hard to come to grips with. Rage is something that is unchecked, and it can have a detrimental effect on my day-to-day life. And
can relate. Never get a job in IT.
But actually, I do work for ITS at UC San Diego. So it's really funny that you say that. I have a lot of patience with my students and with my instructors. My rage is really more on a political level, I guess, and cultural level. Yeah, and the last 2 years have made it very crippling.
Yeah.
And the
you
only thing,
though, I want to ask about that real quick. So, is that a recent thing, or is that all the way back to childhood?
Oh, it's all the way back to childhood. Yeah. No, I mean, my like I said, my father's very political, and he's left leaning, which again is something I've always really found very confusing, because my experience with the religious is very right leaning for the most part in my real life day to day. It's not always the case.
Were you aware of that, like in your childhood? Like, I'm trying to understand where your rage was.
Dude, totally. We went to protests all the time against the Gulf War. Oh man, his rage against Ronald Reagan in the 80s, I'll never forget it. I was drawing pictures of Ronald Reagan getting his head blown off when I was a little kid, because I was channeling my dad's rage.
Yeah.
So yes, no, this is something that is part and parcel with how I grew up and who I am. But I'm
glad you brought this up, because usually the last question we ask is there anything relevant that you're aware of we haven't talked about? And this definitely underscores some stuff.
My way of calming myself down, because even when I was a kid, I recognized that rage was a dangerous thing, and now it's a dangerous thing. I can't talk very well about emotions, as you can tell from this fucking conversation. And partly because my emotions are largely overshadowed by rage. Like all the time. I wake up furious. I go to sleep furious. It's constant. And the only way that I have had in my life to, as kind of a Xanax for these feelings, is watching really violent things. is channeling that through an artistic expression at some point. And it's funny because, like, one thing about that, a very pet peeve of mine is when people will say, how can you watch all these horror movies when you could just watch the news? I'm like, no, the news creates rage.
Yeah.
This other thing is what I use to diffuse rage. This other thing exorcises these demons. The news gives birth to the demons. It's not the same fucking thing. You cannot conflate these two things. What I watch is not real. Like, it's an expression. One is a creation of rage. The other is an expression to get it off of our chest. I remember an interview with the singer of Metallica saying that backstage his fans would be so weirded out that he was so mellow. He was like, I just got this shit off my chest for 3 hours. Right. How else would I be right now?
Right.
I mean, I felt that. I feel that.
It's like exercising for 3 hours. Of course you're going to be more relaxed afterwards.
Exactly.
You've got it all out.
Yeah.
So I haven't said this at all during the call, but I started to see a common thread pretty early in the call, but I'll hold on to that for another few minutes. Let me ask like three more questions. What do you see any common threads about what kind of horror you like? Cannibalism, occult, metaphysical, monster movies?
That's hard because no, and I'm a weirdo with that because that is normally a common thread. I've trained myself so much to go beyond just what is on the surface and see, like, it doesn't matter if I'm watching like a Donald Duck cartoon with a witch or Inside. I'm not focusing so much on like what the monster is or what the story is, but like what human anxiety has to exist in order for this story to be told. You know what I mean? So that's why, like, in my festival, I have had so many conversations with my audience when they're like, wow, I wouldn't have called that a horror film. And then I break down why I think it fits with us. And then they're like, oh, wow, yeah, I wouldn't have thought about it that way. Because I'm looking for an expression of anxiety or fear, you know, like
I think you kind of got to what we wanted to get to anyway, because the next question would be, do you have any idea why it is that you like those things? And you're talking about, you know, looking past the surface for the underlying anxiety or fear, and we could still ask that question: why do you like the underlying anxiety or fear?
Well, so the reason I like the underlying anxiety or fear is because I feel like it's a channeling for my own anxieties and fears. As a curator, you know, I'm not a filmmaker. I never really had a desire to be one. I'm not really an artist in the definition that I draw or paint or write but when I take stories and use stories as the source for a discussion, or as even better, a survey of multiple stories and use them as a source for a particular discussion. That's my artistic creation. That's my expression. That's my mode. And so even when I'm watching these things, not as a curator, not in my capacity as a curator, but just for my own self, my own time, there is something about connecting over misery that is a little more powerful even than connecting over a sunset. You know, it's like they both cause connections, but there's one that's in the gut, you know, and I just need that.
And the last question here that we would normally ask would be, you know, why horror? Because couldn't you get these things in other genres? But really, I think the answer to that in your case is because of the strength of the emotion.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
It's the strength, and also, just to kind of go circle, it's also because horror is stigmatized. I feel like because
it's the
if
underdog.
someone is, yeah, it's the underdog. If someone's going to make something that everyone thinks is trash anyway, then there's some freedom in that to be a little more true and a little more vulnerable and a little, you know, more base. You know, I think that's why historically a lot of horror has had just the basest things, whether they're filled with nudity or blood or that seems to be, especially since a lot of them were made by like young dudes at the time. This is me just being honest on screen. I like this stuff. I'm sure that the people I want to sell this to will like this stuff. And, you know, a lot of people would say, yeah, it's commercial. That's what sells. Well, yeah. Why does it sell? Because let's be honest, people really genuinely feel like they want this. Like, it sells for a reason. And that kind of like, truism, that the sincerity of trashy content is something that I think makes it more sincere. I'm attracted to that. I think that's why you can get that in other genres, but because horror is such a punk rock kind of underdog, as you put it, you can get it a little more unfiltered.
I'm going to read off a list of things that we've talked about in this call.
Okay.
And I want you to think about or question how many of these things refer to either a power imbalance or desire for power or control.
All right.
Werewolves, Phantom of the Opera commanding an audience, authority and cruelty in the diocese, getting jumped in Maryland, questions of fairness, curating for an audience, reacting to the Star Wars special, being the subject of ridicule, participating in protests as a kid, exercising rage, connecting to other people, and punk rock. Like everything that we've talked about in this call really goes back to the power and control of power.
Yeah, power or the lack thereof, the experienced lack thereof.
Right.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely correct. I can't deny any of that.
Yeah, checks out.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Is this something that you find coming up a lot in your conversations? Or is that specific to me?
No, power and
it's
control
definitely
comes up a
come
lot.
up before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not a
I don't know
lot,
if
but I
I'd
would
say
say
a lot,
like,
it definitely comes up.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Like, we didn't get until the very end where you talked about, feeling this sense of rage every day. That was an interesting kind of turning point for me in the call, because I was seeing this pattern, but when you said that was interesting, because it's like, oh, there's something that we haven't talked about.
What makes it really difficult now is my whole life, because of art, really. I have a lot to owe to this art, which is why I'm such a big part of my life. I've been able to live with that. I've been able to get by. I have a great education. I've got a great family. I've got a great relationship. I have
it's
an
definitely
amazing career.
It could definitely be therapeutic.
Yeah. However, since the pandemic started, I have found that it has not worked as well, and it has been harder to control the rage that I'm feeling. It's harder to control it. I feel much more.
Well, it's in our face a lot more.
Yeah, I feel much more despair. I'm usually a very humanistic person. I feel like I'm losing that. and that's my anxiety right now. It's my anxiety right now is feeling like I'm losing empathy.
Mm-hmm.
I really feel like I'm losing empathy. Like, when I hear, like, my first inclination, if I hear about an anti-vaxxer who dies from COVID, I'm going to be very honest, it's joy, it's elation. And that is not cool. Like,
no, it's not healthy.
It's super not healthy.
And not only for you personally, but for the community, for our nation.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's just like that article you shared the other day, Steve, about witnessing the downfall of society in, what was it, Sri Lanka, and how America is pretty much already there.
Right.
Because we ignore things.
Down a similar path.
Yeah. I read that same goddamn article. That might be one of my problems. But
well, and the thing that I think that you're touching on here is part of the rage is that, like you say, having that response is not healthy, but the people that are dying from not being vaccinated are the ones that are causing the reaction, because I'm angry at you, but you're the one causing this.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and that's that's the complication, right? This is not, again, going back to dualism. Horror is comfortable because of dualism. We don't live in a dualistic world. If I'm going to, I have to recognize that when that's how I combat that initial elation I get, is like, I'm thinking in dualistic terms. I'm thinking of like good versus evil, and evil has just been vanquished, and that's just childish, and
yeah, the reality, and it's funny that you say that, because I'm sitting here thinking the reality is more complicated than that. And I even wanted to amend what I said a minute ago about, you're the ones causing this. I understand from their viewpoint, it is more complicated than that. There are people who have questions and concerns, and there are answers.
Exacerbating it. Let's be clear.
Well, yeah, I mean, there are answers to those questions. Yeah. They don't want to hear them, or they don't like the answer, or they don't trust them. That's what makes it more complicated. But at the end of the day, that's what we're struggling with, is the complication.
Oh, it's so hard, man. And it's so hard because you talked about working remotely. I'm working remotely right now, which I'm very lucky that I can do that we can still, I'm very lucky that I'm one of the few people, I feel like, in San Diego who has been able to buy a house with a single income. And, we're not living
in a mansion.
We're not living super comfortable. I mean, I'm really comfortable. I'm very grateful for all these things. And I have to but the fact that I have to tell myself that explicitly, like I'm trying to convince myself.
You have to remind yourself that you're comfortable.
Yeah. And that's, I have it so much better than so many others. Yeah. And a lot of it, was earned, and a lot of it was from being lucky. But, these last 2 years of working remotely, I'm not good at this. And there are now two Miguels. The Miguel that that has elation at someone dying from COVID is the same Miguel that's become an introvert. I'm not, you can probably tell, I'm not an introverted person at all. I've been a teacher. I do presentations. I talk on panels. I do workshops. I do a film festival. I'm very, very much, I'm driven by engagement with other human beings. And in the last year especially, there's a part of me that feels just robbed of being able to do that. But there's a new part of me that is a misanthrope that has become introverted. And those two parts of me now, this is a new dichotomy. This is a new beast. And they're at odds. And they're constantly warring with each other in my head. And I have yet to find like the therapy that I've gotten in the past from watching movies and having discussions. And I don't know, partly it's because I'm not in public. I feel like a big part of it is being in public, but I don't know. This is, I'm still trying to
craving the connection.
Mm-hmm. Craving it. Yeah, but I'm not. Part of me is craving it and the other half is not. What does that mean?
You're afraid of it.
Maybe. Yeah.
Not of the connection, but of the risks right now in the current situation.
Sure. Yeah, maybe that's part of it. I don't know. Anyway, we're getting really crazy off. I don't know if it's what you're trying to do to me, but
it's working.
Yeah, it's working.
Well, I mean, point of the call is to talk about all this stuff and then think about it. And the thinking of it part often does continue after the end of the call. I mean, when I edit these calls, there are times that I've emailed our guests and said, as I was editing it, I was listening to this and I realized I forgot to say this, or this thought popped up in my head that I didn't think of at the time. And, there's some back and forth sometimes with some of our guests on that. And, it's interesting to do this because of the thoughts that it generates,
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's also, it's a testament to the complexity of our experiences.
Yes, and the individuality of them, which is, again, why we have to speak to multiple different people to get all these different viewpoints.
Yeah, well, I'm going to go back and listen to some back episodes because I'm curious to see what some other people have said. Thank you for putting something else on my plate. I appreciate
that. There you
go. Something to keep you occupied in these trying times. Let me wrap up the closing and then give me 1 second. So thank you to anybody out there listening. Please do come visit us at horrormakesushappy.com. We've got links there to our social media, and really the best thing you can do is just tell a friend if you like what you're hearing. horrormakesushappy.com.